Stay out of this, old woman, my son-in-law snapped, his voice sharp enough to silence the entire table. And for a moment, no one moved. No one spoke, not even my own daughter, who sat there staring at her plate like she hadn't just heard her husband dismiss me, as if I were nothing more than an inconvenience in a room I once paid for. And I remember the way the overhead light reflected off the polished oak table. The same table I had chosen 20 years ago when this house was still just a blueprint and a promise. The same table where I had hosted birthdays, holidays, and quiet Sunday dinners, believing I was building something permanent, something unbreakable. And yet there I was, at 68 years old, being told to stay out of a conversation in my own family, as if I were an outsider who had wandered in uninvited. And I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I didn't even look at Ethan right away because I had learned something over the years that most people never do. That dignity is not proven by how loudly you respond, but by how calmly you choose not to. So instead, I folded my hands in my lap and let the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable, long enough for the weight of his words to settle into the room like dust that no one wanted to breathe in. And when I finally looked up, Ethan was leaning back in his chair with that same smug expression he always wore when he thought he had the upper hand, like he had already won an argument no one else realized they were part of, and my daughter, Claire, still wouldn't meet my eyes, which told me more than anything he had said, because silence like that doesn't come from confusion. It comes from agreement, from quiet acceptance, from choosing a side without having the courage to say it out loud. And I felt something shift inside me then. Not anger, not even hurt, but clarity. The kind that arrives without warning and changes everything in an instant. Because in that moment, I understood that this wasn't about a single rude comment or a bad night at dinner. This was about how they had begun to see me, how they had been seeing me for a long time without me noticing, as someone whose role had already ended, someone whose presence was optional, someone they could dismiss without consequence. And I realized just how easy it had been for them to forget who I was before I became mom, before I became mother-in-law, before I stepped back and let them believe they were the ones in control. So I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my blouse the way I always did when I needed a moment to collect myself. And I said nothing, not because I had nothing to say, but because I had already decided that whatever needed to be said would not happen at that table, not in that moment, and certainly not in a way that gave him the satisfaction of thinking he had pushed me into a reaction. So I picked up my purse, nodded once as if the evening had gone exactly as expected, and walked toward the door with the same steady pace I had used my entire life. The same pace that had carried me through boardrooms, negotiations, and decisions that shaped more lives than anyone at that table could imagine. And as I reached the hallway, I heard Ethan let out a small, dismissive laugh behind me, the kind of laugh that assumes the story is already over, that the outcome has already been decided. And I almost smiled, not because anything about that moment was amusing, but because I knew something he didn't, something none of them did. And as I stepped out into the cool evening air, I took a slow breath and let it out, already planning my next move, because the truth was, Ethan had just made one very simple mistake, the kind people make when they mistake silence for weakness, and by the time he realized what that mistake had cost him, it would already be far too late. I did not drive home right away. Instead, I sat in my car with the engine off, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel as the quiet of the night wrapped around me. And for a long moment, I simply listened to my own breathing, steady and controlled, the way it had always been when things mattered most. Because what had just happened inside that dining room was not new. Not really. It was only the first time it had been said out loud with enough clarity that I could no longer pretend it was anything else. And as I looked at the dark outline of Claire's house in my rearview mirror, I began to replay the past few years with a different kind of attention, the kind that strips away excuses and leaves only patterns. And suddenly things that once felt small began to take on a sharper edge. The holidays where I was told plans had changed at the last minute. The conversations that seemed to happen without me and then be summarized afterward as if my opinion was a formality. The subtle way Ethan would correct me in front of others, not aggressively, never enough to cause a scene, but just enough to establish a hierarchy that I had chosen not to see. And I realized that none of this had happened overnight. It had been built piece by piece, moment by moment. Until tonight it finally revealed itself in a single sentence that could not be taken back, and the more I thought about it, the more I understood that Ethan had not simply been careless. He had been comfortable enough to believe that there would be no consequence, that I existed outside of anything that could affect him, and that belief did not come from nowhere. It came from what he had been allowed to see, or more accurately, what I had allowed him to see, because for years I had chosen to remain in the background, to let Claire and Ethan build their life without interference, to offer help quietly and step away just as quietly. And in doing so, I had created an illusion, one where my presence seemed optional and my influence invisible. And as I sat there, I felt that clarity settle deeper, not heavy, not painful, just precise, like a line being drawn where none had existed before. And without rushing, without hesitation, I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I needed, the one I rarely used outside of business hours. And I paused for just a second before pressing call, not because I was unsure, but because I understood exactly what this moment meant. And when the line connected, I heard the familiar, professional tone on the other end, and I spoke calmly, as if this were any other request, any other evening, asking for a full review of the Parker account, including all recent personnel changes and internal reports. And there was a brief pause, just long enough for the request to register, before the response came back with quiet confirmation. No questions asked, no surprise in the voice, just efficiency, the kind that exists when people understand who they are speaking to. And when I ended the call, I set the phone back down in my lap and looked forward again, the street empty, the world unchanged. And yet everything about my situation had shifted in a way that could not be undone, because this was no longer about a family disagreement or a moment of disrespect. This was about understanding the full picture, about seeing clearly where everyone stood. And as I finally started the engine and pulled away from the curb, I did not feel anger. I did not feel the need to prove anything. I only felt a quiet certainty, the kind that comes when you stop asking whether something is true and start deciding what you are going to do about it. The next morning arrived with the same quiet precision that had defined most of my life, sunlight slipping through the sheer curtains of my bedroom, casting soft lines across the hardwood floor, and I moved through my routine without interruption, making coffee, setting a single cup on the kitchen counter, and standing there for a moment as the aroma filled the space. Because there is something revealing about how a house feels when it is occupied by only one person. No noise, no conversation. Just the faint hum of appliances and the sound of your own thoughts becoming clearer than you might prefer. And as I stirred my coffee slowly, I found myself thinking not about what Ethan had said, but about how easily he had said it, how natural it had seemed to him, as if dismissing me required no effort at all. And that kind of ease does not come from confidence alone. It comes from reinforcement, from a pattern that has never been challenged. And I began to wonder how many times he had tested that boundary in smaller ways, ways I had chosen to overlook in the name of keeping peace, ways Claire had quietly accepted because confronting them would have required more strength than silence. And I took a sip of my coffee, letting the warmth settle, grounding me in the present, because dwelling on regret had never been useful to me. Only clarity had value, and clarity was exactly what I intended to follow. So after finishing breakfast, I changed into a navy blazer and a simple blouse, the kind of outfit that did not draw attention but carried its own authority, and I left the house at precisely 8:30, arriving downtown just before 9, the city already alive with movement, people crossing streets with purpose, cars lining up at lights, the rhythm of a workday unfolding exactly as it always did. And when I stepped into the building, the lobby attendant nodded immediately, greeting me by name, not with surprise, but with familiarity, and I returned the gesture with the same quiet acknowledgement, moving toward the elevators without slowing down, because this was a space where nothing needed to be explained, where roles were understood without being spoken. And as the elevator doors closed and carried me upward, I allowed myself a brief moment to consider how different this environment was from the one I had left the night before. Here, respect was not optional. It was expected, built into every interaction, every decision, every outcome. And when the doors opened onto the executive floor, I stepped out into a hallway lined with glass offices and subdued conversations. The atmosphere controlled, deliberate, and I walked directly to my office, where a neatly organized folder was already waiting on my desk, exactly as requested, and I did not open it immediately. Instead, I set my bag down, took off my coat, and stood for a moment looking out the window at the city below, because I understood that once I began reading, there would be no going back to assumptions, only facts, and facts have a way of reshaping everything they touch. And when I finally sat down and opened the folder, the first page confirmed what I already suspected: Ethan Parker. Recent hire, fast-tracked through internal recommendations, and beneath that, a name that required no introduction: Richard Parker, Senior Manager, direct reporting line within my division. And I let my eyes move steadily across the page, absorbing each detail without reaction, because this was no longer about emotions or family dynamics. This was about structure, about understanding exactly where each piece fit. And as the information settled into place, I felt that same quiet certainty return, the kind that leaves no room for doubt, only for action, measured, precise, and entirely inevitable. The rest of the morning passed without interruption, but beneath the surface of every routine task, there was a quiet shift in how I observed things, as if a layer had been removed and replaced with something sharper, more deliberate, and I spent the next hour reviewing the details in that folder line by line, not rushing, not skimming, because the truth rarely hides in dramatic revelations. It reveals itself in small consistencies, in patterns that only become visible when you are patient enough to look for them. And what I saw was not surprising, but it was telling. Ethan had been brought into the company through a referral tied directly to his father, placed into a role that offered more visibility than responsibility, the kind of position that allows someone to appear capable without ever being fully tested. And I traced the progression of his assignments, noting how quickly he had been moved forward, how frequently his performance reviews leaned on vague language rather than measurable results. And I leaned back slightly in my chair, considering what that meant, because advancement without substance does not happen by accident. It happens when someone believes they are protected, when they assume the system will bend in their favor, and that assumption often extends beyond the workplace, into how they treat people, into how they carry themselves in situations where they feel untouchable. And I thought about the dinner again, not the words themselves, but the confidence behind them, the certainty that there would be no consequence. And now I understood exactly where that certainty came from. It had been reinforced here, in these pages, in these decisions, in the quiet approvals that allowed him to move forward unchecked. And I closed the folder gently, placing it back on the desk with the same care I used for everything that mattered. Because this was no longer about discovering anything new. It was about deciding what to do with what I already knew. And just then, there was a soft knock at the door, followed by my assistant stepping in with her usual composed demeanor, informing me that the internal review I had requested could be scheduled as early as the following day, and I nodded. Once, giving a simple instruction to proceed, no urgency in my tone, no indication that anything was out of the ordinary, because the most effective decisions are rarely the loudest ones. They are the ones that unfold exactly as planned, without drawing attention until it is too late to change the outcome. And after she left, I turned my attention back to the window, watching the movement of the city below, each person following their own path, unaware of how quickly circumstances can shift when they are built on assumptions rather than reality. And I allowed myself a brief moment to reflect on how easily I had separated these two parts of my life for so long. Family on one side, business on the other, never letting them overlap, never allowing one to influence the other, believing that keeping them apart was the right thing to do. And perhaps it had been, until now, because what had happened at that table was not simply a personal matter. It was a reflection of something larger, something that now extended into both worlds, and ignoring that connection would only allow the same pattern to continue. And I had never been someone who allowed patterns like that to go unchecked. So I reached for the phone once more, making a second call, this time requesting that both Richard Parker and Ethan Parker be present for the review meeting, no exceptions, no rescheduling. And when the confirmation came through, I set the phone down and folded my hands together, the decision already made, not out of anger, not out of pride, but out of something far more stable, an understanding that respect, once lost, is not restored through words, it is redefined through actions. And this time, Those actions would be impossible to ignore. The following day began exactly on schedule, and by 9 o'clock the conference room on the executive floor was already prepared, the long glass table polished to a quiet shine, documents neatly arranged at each seat, and a stillness in the air that only existed in rooms where decisions carried weight. And I arrived a few minutes early, as I always did, taking my place at the head of the table without ceremony, setting my folder down and reviewing its contents one last time, not because I needed to, but because precision had always been a habit rather than a necessity. And as the clock moved forward, I could hear footsteps approaching from the hallway, measured, confident, unaware, and the door opened with a soft click as Richard Parker stepped in first, his posture straight, but his expression shifting the moment he saw me seated there, a flicker of recognition crossing his face before it settled into something more cautious, more restrained, and behind him, Ethan followed, his movements relaxed, almost casual, as if this were just another meeting. On an ordinary day, and for a brief second, his eyes met mine without recognition, without hesitation, and then I watched as that moment stretched just long enough for realization to begin forming, not fully, not yet, but enough to create a subtle pause in his step, and I said nothing. I did not greet them, did not acknowledge the shift. I simply gestured toward the seats across from me, maintaining the same calm composure that had carried me through far more complex situations than this. And they sat down, Richard more carefully than Ethan, his movements controlled, deliberate, while Ethan adjusted his chair with the same easy confidence he had displayed at the dinner table, though now there was a slight tension beneath it, something unspoken but present, and I opened the folder in front of me, allowing the silence to settle into the room before I began, because silence has a way of revealing more than words ever could. And when I finally spoke, my voice was even, measured, without accusation or emotion, outlining the purpose of the review, discussing performance metrics, structural alignment, and internal recommendations, each point delivered with clarity, each detail grounded in fact. And as I spoke, I watched them both carefully, not for dramatic reactions, but for the subtle shifts that indicate understanding, the tightening of a jaw, the way a hand rests more firmly against the table, the slight change in breathing that comes when certainty begins to slip, and it did not take long. Because the information was clear, the connections unmistakable, and I could see the moment Richard fully understood the situation, his posture straightening further, his responses becoming more precise, more cautious, while Ethan, on the other hand, began to lose that effortless confidence, his earlier composure giving way to something less certain, his answers shorter, less assured, as if he were trying to recalibrate in real time without fully grasping what had already shifted around him. And still, I did not raise my voice. I did not confront him directly about anything outside of the documents in front of us, because this was not about personal grievances, it was about structure, about accountability, about ensuring that every role within the organization was supported by merit rather than assumption. And as the meeting progressed, the balance of the room changed in a way that required no explanation, no announcement, only presence, only clarity. And by the time I closed the folder and folded my hands together on the table, the difference between the confidence Ethan had carried into the room and the uncertainty that now surrounded him was unmistakable. And I met his eyes once more, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a calm, unwavering steadiness that left no room for misinterpretation. Because some lessons are not taught through words. They are understood through the quiet realization that everything you believed about your position was built on something far less stable than you imagined. When the meeting ended, I did not rush to stand. I simply gathered the documents in front of me with the same measured care I had shown throughout, allowing the final seconds of silence to settle into something unmistakable, and Richard was the first to rise, offering a brief, controlled acknowledgement before stepping back, his expression composed but no longer relaxed, while Ethan remained seated just a moment longer, as if trying to reconcile what had just happened with the version of reality he had walked in with. And when he finally stood, there was a hesitation in his movement that had not been there before, a subtle uncertainty that spoke louder than any apology ever could, and I gave neither of them additional instructions, no final remarks, no personal comments, because everything that needed to be understood had already been made clear without being spoken. And as they left the room, the door closing softly behind them, I allowed myself a brief pause, not to reflect on them, but to acknowledge the shift that had taken place, because moments like that are not defined by confrontation. They are defined by recognition, by the quiet realization that roles have been misunderstood and are now being corrected. And I stood, straightened my blazer, and walked back to my office without interruption, the hallway as calm and orderly as it had been earlier, as if nothing significant had occurred, which is often how the most important changes unfold, quietly, without spectacle, but with lasting effect. And once inside, I resumed my work as I always did, reviewing reports, responding to messages, making decisions that had nothing to do with personal matters and everything to do with maintaining a system that functioned on clarity and accountability, because that was the standard I had built, and I had no intention of allowing it to shift for anyone, not even for family. And it was not until later that afternoon that my phone rang with a name I had expected but did not anticipate so soon, Claire, and I let it ring once, twice, before answering, my voice steady as I greeted her. And there was a brief silence on the other end, the kind that carries weight, before she finally spoke, her tone uncertain, careful, as if she were stepping into unfamiliar territory, and she asked if we could talk, not later, not tomorrow, but now. And I could hear something in her voice that had not been there the night before, something quieter, more aware, and I agreed without hesitation, suggesting we meet at a small cafe a few blocks from my office, neutral ground, a place where conversation could happen without the presence of either home or hierarchy. And when I arrived, she was already there, sitting by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup she had not touched, her posture tense in a way that mirrored something deeper than simple discomfort. And as I approached, she looked up, and for the first time in a long while, she did not avoid my gaze, and I took the seat across from her without speaking, giving her the space to begin, because this time, whatever needed to be said would come from her, not from me. And she took a slow breath before finally asking a question that told me everything had already changed, not in the way she expected, but in a way she could no longer ignore. Claire's fingers tightened slightly around the cup as she looked at me, her eyes searching my face as if she were trying to find something familiar, something that would make this easier to say, but the words still came out slower than usual, more careful, as she asked me why Ethan had called her in a panic that morning, why his father had suddenly been pulled into a formal review, and most importantly, why my name had come up in a way she had clearly never expected. And I did not answer immediately, not because I was avoiding her question, but because I wanted her to sit with it for a moment longer, to feel the weight of what she was asking rather than rushing past it. And I simply held her gaze, steady and calm, the same way I had in that conference room, until she finally looked down at her cup again, as if the silence itself had already given her part of the answer. And when I spoke, my voice was even, without accusation, without defensiveness. I told her that nothing unusual had happened, that a routine review had been conducted based on information that required attention, and that every decision made in that room followed the same standards that applied to everyone. And she listened, but I could see that she was not only hearing the words, she was beginning to understand what they meant, because this was not about a sudden change. It was about something that had always been true but had never been visible to her. And she asked me then, more quietly, why I had never told her, why I had never mentioned my position, and I allowed a small pause before answering, not out of hesitation, but to choose the words that mattered. And I told her that I had never believed it was necessary, that I wanted her to build her life without feeling overshadowed, without thinking that anything she had came from me rather than from her own choices, and that keeping that distance had seemed like the right thing to do at the time. And she nodded slightly, but there was a tension in her expression that had not fully settled, because understanding something does not always make it easier to accept. And after a moment, she looked back at me, her voice softer now, almost uncertain, as she asked if this was about what had happened at dinner. And I met her eyes again, holding that steady calm that had guided me through everything so far. And I told her that it was not about a single moment, not about one sentence spoken in anger or frustration, but about a pattern, about how people choose to speak and act when they believe there will be no consequence. And I watched as that realization settled over her, not all at once, but gradually, like something she had felt before but never fully acknowledged, and she sat back slightly, her grip on the cup loosening, her posture shifting as if she were seeing the situation from a different angle for the first time. And for a while, neither of us spoke, the quiet between us. No longer tense, but reflective, and when she finally did speak again, it was not to argue or defend, but to ask what would happen next, and I answered her honestly, telling her that what happens next would depend on actions, not on apologies. That respect is not something that can be restored through words alone. It is something that must be demonstrated consistently, and I let that sit between us, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a simple truth, and she nodded slowly, her eyes no longer avoiding mine. And in that moment, I could see that something had shifted, not completely, not yet, but enough to change the direction of what would come next. And as we sat there in that quiet cafe, with the city moving around us as it always did, I realized that this conversation, unlike the one at that dinner table, was not about control or dismissal. It was about recognition, about seeing clearly what had been ignored for far too long, and deciding, finally, whether it would continue or come to an end. Claire did not rush to respond after my last words. Instead, she sat there quietly, her eyes drifting for a moment toward the window where people passed by, without noticing the weight of the conversation unfolding just a few feet away, and I could see the conflict in her expression, not dramatic, not loud, but present in the small details, the way her shoulders held tension, the way her fingers traced the edge of her cup without lifting it, and when she finally spoke again, her voice was softer than before, almost careful, as she admitted that she had noticed changes over the past year. Small things at first, the way Ethan would dismiss certain conversations, the way he would decide things without including her, the way he spoke about people as if their value depended entirely on what they could offer him. And she paused there, as if saying it out loud made it more real than she was ready for, and I listened without interrupting, because this was not something I could give her. It was something she had to recognize on her own, and she continued, explaining that she had told herself it was stress, that work had been demanding, that building a future required focus, and I nodded slightly at that, not because I agreed, but because I understood how easy it is to justify what we do not want to confront. And then she looked back at me, her expression more open now, less defensive, and she asked whether I believed people could change, whether what had happened could be corrected without everything falling apart. And I considered her question carefully, not because I needed time to think, but because I wanted my answer to be clear. And I told her that people can change when they choose to, but change does not come from being told what is wrong. It comes from facing the consequences of it, from understanding that actions carry weight whether we acknowledge them or not, and that avoiding those consequences only delays the moment when reality becomes unavoidable. And she listened, her eyes steady now, absorbing each word without looking away, and for a moment, there was something familiar in that expression, something that reminded me of the way she used to look at me when she was younger, when she was still learning how the world worked and believed that I had the answers. And perhaps in some ways, she still did. But this time, the answer was not something I could hand to her. It was something she would have to live through, and after a long pause, she nodded once, a small, deliberate movement that carried more meaning than anything she had said so far, and she told me that she needed to go home, that she needed to talk to Ethan. And I did not stop her. I did not offer advice or direction, because this was her decision to make, her line to draw, and as she stood, she hesitated for just a second before reaching for her bag, as if there were still something unsaid, something she had not yet found the words for. But then she simply said that she understood now, not everything, but enough, and I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging her without adding anything more, because sometimes understanding does not need to be explained, it only needs to be recognized. And as she walked out of the cafe, disappearing into the steady flow of the afternoon, I remained seated for a moment longer, finishing the last of my coffee. The bitterness now familiar, almost grounding, and I knew that whatever happened next would not be decided by what was said in that conversation, but by what followed it, by the choices made when no one else was watching. And I stood, placing a few bills on the table before stepping back into the city, the rhythm of it unchanged, the world continuing exactly as it always had. But somewhere within that movement, a shift had already begun, quiet, precise, and impossible to reverse. That evening, I did not expect a call, and yet when my phone lit up with Claire's name again just after 7, I knew immediately that whatever conversation had taken place at that house had not been simple, and when I answered, her voice was different, steadier than before, but carrying a weight that had not been there earlier, and she did not begin with explanations or apologies. She simply said that she had spoken to Ethan, that the conversation had been difficult, and that for the first time, she had not stepped back or softened her words to keep the peace, and I listened quietly, allowing her to continue without interruption, because this was no longer about what I needed to say. It was about what she had chosen to do, and she told me that she had asked him directly about his behavior, not just at dinner, but over the past year, about the way he spoke, the way he made decisions, the way he treated people as if respect were something optional rather than expected, and she paused there, taking a breath before continuing, explaining that he had tried to dismiss it at first, to frame it as stress, as pressure, as misunderstanding. But this time she had not accepted those explanations. She had stayed in the conversation, had held her ground, and had made it clear that what she saw was not temporary. It was a pattern, and patterns do not disappear simply because we choose to ignore them. And as she spoke, I could hear something else beneath her words, not anger, not frustration, but resolve, the kind that does not need to be loud to be effective. And she told me that Ethan had eventually fallen silent, not in agreement, not in full understanding, but in a way that suggested he was hearing something he could no longer dismiss, and that for now, that was enough. Not a solution, not a resolution, but a beginning. And when she finished, there was a brief quiet between us, not uncomfortable, not uncertain, just a space where everything that needed to be said had already been expressed, and I told her that what she had done mattered, not because it fixed anything immediately, but because it changed the direction of what would come next, and she acknowledged that, her voice soft but steady, and then, after a moment, she said something that stayed with me, that she finally understood that respect is not something you wait to receive. It is something you require through your choices, through what you allow and what you refuse to accept. And I let that settle before responding, because there was nothing to add, nothing to correct, and as the call came to an end, I set my phone down and looked around my home. The same quiet space I had returned to the night before, but it felt different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because the uncertainty that once lingered there had been replaced with something far more defined. And I moved through the evening with the same calm rhythm I had always known, preparing a simple dinner, clearing the dishes, turning off the lights one by one. And as I stood for a moment in the hallway before heading upstairs, I reflected not on what had been said or done, but on what had been understood, because in the end, it was never about proving a point or reclaiming control. It was about restoring something far more fundamental, a boundary that should never have been crossed in the first place. And now that it had been seen clearly, it would not be ignored again, not by me, not by Claire, and certainly not by anyone who believed that silence meant permission, because it never did. It only meant that the moment for response had not yet arrived, and now that it had, everything that followed would be shaped not by assumption, but by choice, steady, deliberate, and impossible to misunderstand.